also probably more widely known because I practice as a barrister at Garden Court Chambers. But I've had the great privilege as a consequence of being and helping, I hope, to some extent along the process, two of our amazing students who are going to join us for this seminar now. That's Claire Nevin and Stefano Braschi. And what we're going to be talking about is success in obtaining pupillage. And we're very, very fortunate indeed, because we're also joined by Amy Stout, who's at 3 Dr. Johnston's Buildings, who can also give you some insight, I hope, into success and tips, both for those applications and then hopefully all the inevitable interviews and assessment days that will then follow. So first of all, I should say that there is an ability to ask questions. Please feel free to do so. You can do that either with your name or alternatively anonymously. It really doesn't matter. It's a safe space. Feel free to ask whatever questions you want. As we say, when you're going through pupillage, there's no such thing actually as a stupid question. We've all been there. You trust me, the amount of different types of questions we get asked, you'll never be the one that asks the silliest. So what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to ask each person to introduce themselves and so that they can tell you a little bit about them. So Amy, perhaps if I can turn to you first and you can tell us a little bit about your route to the bar.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Amy. I'm a specialist family barrister at a chambers called 3 Dr. Johnston's Buildings. I was called in 2013, so I've been doing this job now for a lot longer than I think I have. And I'm head of pupillage as well. I've been on the pupillage panel at my chambers for the last 4 or 5 years. So I've got lots of experience now of being on the other side of the interviews, which is a little bit terrifying as well in a different way. My route to the bar was relatively straightforward. I did a history degree and then a master's, and then I did a law conversion course. I actually did that in Manchester because I really wanted to practice in Manchester. It's where I'm from. I really, really enjoyed family law. I knew I wanted to do family law, so I applied for pupillage, both in Manchester and in specialist family sets in London. Happened to get a pupillage in London, at Chambers called 14, and then came to London, and now I'm here really, practicing family in London and intend to stay. So
fantastic. A great addition to London. And then if I can turn perhaps now to Claire. And Claire, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, about the route that you've taken in terms of coming to the ICCA and on the bar course, what you're currently doing and your upcoming pupillage. And congratulations again.
Thanks, Jo. Thanks very much. Yes, everybody, I'm Claire. I'm from Ireland originally, coming to the bar a little bit later, having already worked for a few years, mostly in human rights. So I first qualified with a degree in European Studies back in 2014. And then I went on to do a human rights master's, and I spent a number of years working in Strasbourg for a while, in Geneva as well, in Dublin with an NGO, and wanted to come to the bar probably as a result actually of my campaigning in the abortion referendum in Ireland, working closely with lawyers trying to amend the constitution to make abortion legal. And I suppose it was the first insight I got really into the power of the law and kind of coming at a socio-legal approach. Couldn't afford to do the bar at that stage. Initially wanted to do it in Ireland, so saved up for a number of years, realised for reasons about the Irish system that it's quite hard to get into, particularly lack of scholarships and the like. So somebody mentioned to me, have you heard of the GDL? I had no idea what a GDL was. Spent about a full day Googling, opening 50 tabs on the computer, trying to figure out ins of court, the whole thing. By the end of the day, then decided I would actually pursue it in London. So I was fortunate to get a scholarship, which helped me immensely. Did the GDL at City University and the bar course then at the Inns of Court. Applied for pupillage 2 years in a row, didn't get it on my first year, and got it this year. And I'll be going to Francis Taylor Building next October. So I have a year in between. And what I'm doing now, I'm working. I've had the same job for the last couple of years through my GDL and bar course. So I'm working with the Gulf Centre for Human Rights on freedom of expression and freedom of assembly in the Gulf region and neighbouring region as well. So it's nice. It's a calmer year for me than the previous few. So I'm enjoying that before pupillage.
Fantastic. And I think it's fair to say, Claire, that a lot of hard work went into your applications.
A lot of hard work and a lot of help from other people as well to get me there, including yourself.
I'm still disappointed that she's not coming to Garden Court, but we won't dwell on that. And then we go to Stefano, who's equally as successful. And Stefano, if you can do the same, please.
Yeah, of course. I actually I came to the bar even later than Claire, so she'll be happy to hear that, but she knows it already. And I have, I guess, a slightly unusual path, although an important takeaway from today should be that there is no one obvious path or one obvious candidate. So I studied history also at university. I had no intention at that time or consideration for pursuing a path towards the bar or the law, even in general. After university, I trained and then worked as an actor for over 10 years, which shows my age. And for various reasons, which I don't need to go into, I was thinking about a new challenge, a new career. And that's how I started to turn my attention towards the law and then the bar specifically. I made the decision to apply to do the GDL, having spoken with a barrister friend of mine and understood a bit about what the profession might entail, but really just to see if I would like it and to give it a go. I didn't know more than that. And for any career changers who might be watching or listening, I think it is important to know that you're never going to know if you take that path, if you decide to potentially change your career, whether it will be the right move or not. But that's not something that should stop you from trying or looking into it. So I, like Claire, attended the GDL at City. And during that time is when I really knuckled down and tried to learn as much as I could about the profession, about the various practice areas, which I'd already been introduced to by doing mini pupillages before starting the GDL. And I gave it a go. I applied for pupillage during the GDL and was very fortunate to be able to accept an offer that year, which stood me in good stead to then do the bar course at the ICCA. And I just started pupillage in October at Serle Court Chambers in London.
Thank you, Stefano. And perhaps if I can just interject there to say that one of the most frequent questions I'm always asked about is when you ought to make your pupillage applications. And for my part, and I don't know whether Amy, Claire and Stefano agree, the earlier the better. There is a gateway that will open. Most chambers are following the gateway. It's not mandatory quite yet, but it more or less is in practice. And the gateway will open in January with applications window closing in February. Do not lose out on that opportunity. You may not think your CV is good enough now. You may think you need to get more experience, but it is an opportunity. And frankly, as I say to many, many people, if you're not in it, you can't win it. And it is a year, and the applications timetable only comes around typically once a year with some very few exceptions. And you need to maximize your opportunities because you are limited in the number that you can apply to. So please, whatever else you take away from today, if you are serious about a career at the bar, get researching now, get those applications in, even if you're using it as a practice round. It's good practice. And I know certainly, I think, Claire, you'd probably agree with that, having been through it previously the year before. It certainly stood you in good stead this year.
Absolutely.
So perhaps then if I start by asking some questions, if I may, to the panelists about applications, because I think it's fair to say that everybody is apprehensive and nervous when it comes to applying for pupillage, and obviously pupillage is very competitive. But before you even begin that process, you need to work out where you want to be and who you want to apply to. Because no good going into the bar generally, as opposed to finding the area you really want to practice in. So perhaps if I can begin in terms of perhaps turning to Claire and Stefano first of all, because you've had most recent experience, what approach did you take to researching chambers to apply to?
So on my first year, I think I took quite a narrow approach, really, probably because it was all very new to me and quite, very different and daunting experience, as I'm sure a lot of students can relate to. So I was grappling with, moving countries, doing the GDL, working alongside. I knew I wanted a broadly speaking human rights public law practice. So I sent in quite a narrow amount of applications, a small number of chambers, the usual suspects really. Didn't get any second rounds the first year. And the second year, I really took a whole new approach to it. I started to think more broadly. I started to think, okay, with human rights, broadly speaking, what does it mean? I knew I had a kind of burgeoning interest in environmental law as well. And I was seeing different cases pop up, with environmental law and human rights arguments being used hand in hand. So I started to expand the scope of the chambers I was researching about and applying to. And so my second year then I sent in 23 applications, which sounds like an awful lot, and it is. I think mostly because I decided if it didn't work out for me this year for personal reasons and kind of keeping my I suppose my personal life in suspension, seeing as London and UK is in my home, I said I'd try maybe have a different type of legal career. So I threw it all at it and applied, sometimes to criminal defence sets, to public law, human rights sets, really quite broad. And I think something that helped me research was I didn't have Twitter in my first year applying. And even just get it to be a spectator, you will learn so much. And there's so many barristers there who, give their opinions and insights into their chambers, pupillage tips. So that's a great resource. I cold called sometimes or cold emailed some barristers and asking them, about their practice or about their chambers. And people actually do respond. You'll be surprised. People are very generous with their time. So sometimes I had a call with a barrister, they'd answer my questions very kindly over email, or that gave me great insight. Chamber Student as well is a very good resource. It gives a kind of no holds bars approach and view on chambers from a pupillage applicant perspective and going in at a junior end. So that really helps as well. And so I think obviously bar the main thing of course, looking at the website. I mean, that's something that you should really start with as well. Try to think more broadly and seeing where you can get insight into barristers and their work outside of that. Webinars are a great example of that too. Sometimes if I saw a chambers that interested me and I saw a barrister was speaking on a webinar, I would join. So that's kind of broadly how I went about researching it.
And what about you?
Yeah, I think all I'd add to that is definitely speak to anyone and everyone you can. So far, at least, everyone has been incredibly generous with their time, in my case. And I would say that nowadays, it's probably very different even to 18 months ago or what it was 2 years ago. Most things, if they exist in terms of events, are online. It might be more difficult to travel to London if you're not in London, where many of the sets are based, but not all, of course. In my case, I was very fortunate because I live in London, and because of the job I had at the time, I had the time to apply before I started my studies to do mini pupillages. Obviously, not everyone has the time to do umpteen mini pupillages, and the landscape now is very different. But there are, I know, in many cases, the opportunity to do virtual mini pupillages, and so as a next step after perhaps, well, in my case, I went through Chambers and Partners and just started there. I thought about the areas of law I was interested in and looked up the various chambers that excelled in those areas, or even didn't excel but were involved in those specific practice areas, and just worked from there. And mini pupillages are, at whatever stage you might be able to undertake them, a really great way of getting to know about that set of chambers. And I'm sure we'll come on to it, but I think when it does come to an interview, if you get that far, having some sense of what that chambers does, its ethos, what individual members have said, or their kind of individual practice will be really helpful. So certainly don't just think the whole way through about the abstract, but also the individual sets of chambers. Would you like to work there? What kind of practice might you develop there? And that would, I think, hopefully stand you in good stead when you make your applications.
Thank you both. And I certainly would echo, social media has many ills, but it's actually very useful for pupillage applicants. And also because you will become aware of all of the events that Stefano was talking about. The one advantage of the pandemic, and there aren't that many, let's be honest, but the one advantage of the pandemic is that chambers have pivoted massively. There are open days and virtual mini pupillages that are taking place all over the place, and they are far more accessible as a consequence actually to students, not least because we can accommodate more students. There's only so many mini pupillages that chambers can host. But if it's online and virtual, then I wouldn't say the numbers are endless, but it's not far away from that position. Just picking up on that for a moment, just looking at the questions that are coming in, I'm just going to ask about mini pupillages. And Amy, you might be able to come in on this. I know I have a few. Jack asks, I've heard it can be off-putting to do too many mini pupillages. What are your opinions?
Yeah, I don't think you can do too many mini pupillages, but I do think what you can, and nor do I think you need to do, a ridiculous number of mini pupillages either. The purpose of a mini pupillage is in part to have it on your CV so you can say, here's what I've done. I've got insight into criminal law, family law, human rights, or whatever your mini pupillages are in. But it's also for you to learn what practice areas you want to do. Is this a job you actually want? Because the nature of being a barrister in all the different practice areas is very, very different. If you do criminal and family, you'll find that you're largely advocacy-based, court-based, lots of oral advocacy. If you do a more civil practice, you could still spend a lot of time in court, but you could actually find you in court 1 or 2 times a month, depending on the type of law. So it's really important that you understand the nature of the different areas of law, and that you, if you have the opportunity to do mini pupilages, do them. On the other hand, you don't always have to tell everybody in your pupillage applications about all the mini pupilages you've done. If you've done loads, and maybe you've done loads of, I don't know, criminal mini pupilages and decided that criminal law isn't for you, you don't need to put them all on there. You could just say, I've done 1 or 2. But generally, I wouldn't say that anyone is put off by mini pupillage applications, mini pupillage experience. If anything, it shows experience. But if anybody out there is thinking, I don't have time to do all of that, I'm working, I've got a degree that I'm doing as well, then you don't have to do loads either. But it's important that you do some if you can.
Yeah, I would echo that from a recruitment perspective as opposed from a student's perspective. The most benefit that people will see from mini pupilages is for the individual to work out what area of law they want to practice in and the culture and chambers of and ethos of the chambers that they're at. The reality is that you're not going to pick up marks, generally speaking, on a pupillage application form for a mini pupillage per se. What it will go to is either your interest in a chambers or a career at the bar, or a commitment to a career at the bar. And that's why I say, if you think about it from just take a step back from a logical perspective, in terms of a mini pupillage, chambers doesn't really get anything out of you doing a mini pupillage. The advantage is for you, and for you to be able to use that to explain why you want to do an area of law, or your commitment in the law, or any of those questions that you will be asked. So just bear that in mind. You don't need to do hundreds. If you've got hundreds, fantastic. If you haven't, it doesn't really matter. I think, again, Amy's picked up on something, which is you want to make yourself as attractive as you can to the chambers that you're applying to. So if you've got 15 criminal mini pupilages, but you're applying to an exclusively commercial set, then you might want to have a little bit of a think about that and be a bit more strategic in your approach. Those types of things, I think, are relevant. I don't know if you agree with that, Amy, but it's not off-putting. If you've got hundreds of mini pupilages, it's just not going to be enough to just have mini pupilages. You're going to need to fill out your form and to develop your candidature in different ways. Mini pupilages just won't get you there alone, but they're very important as a learning experience, and as I say, as material to use for the various questions that you're having. Got a very quick question, which is, are mini pupilages available for first-year law students? I'll take it very shortly. They often are. Some chambers they will not be. You'll have to look at the individual chambers. It's also worth noting that for some chambers, mini pupilages are assessed. They are part of the assessment process, and they can be, and often chambers that include those are potentially recruiting up to 2 years in advance. So that's why I say, look now, do your research now. I've got on here a question from Kola, who's saying, speaking of applying as early as possible, would you recommend applying for pupillage while studying the MA Law Conversion GDL, or is it better to wait? I think my view is probably already pretty clear. Amy, I don't know if you want to come in on that.
Yeah, I entirely agree with Jo. I think that there's a real temptation for people who are wanting to become barristers to try and have this really perfect application, make sure they're ready. It's so important that you get experience in the pupillage process. It's a really difficult process. It's quite a draining process. The more opportunities that you have to do it sooner, the better. Obviously, if you're doing a GDL, you'll be limited to only applying. So if you haven't yet, no, you are doing a GDL, you'll be limited to only applying to chambers that are advertising pupillage about 18 months in advance, because you couldn't do a pupillage that requires you to have a bar course. But if you don't apply for pupillage, you don't get pupillage. That's the ultimate point. And so I would recommend applying as early as you can, getting that experience, perhaps managing your expectations if you feel that you're not ready, that it's a practice round, and if you get interviews, that's a bonus. If you get a pupillage, brilliant. But you'll never get a pupillage if you don't apply for one. And if you just wait until you think you're ready, or you think your application is perfect, you might find yourself waiting for much longer.
And Stefano, success story.
I wanted to ask you both, actually, because I think in my position when I was doing the GDL, I was worried. Yes, I'd like to do a practice round and put my all into it in case I get lucky. But I also don't want to do myself a disservice by perhaps applying this year, not being that impressive. And perhaps once I have a better background next year, I'll have already given less favorable first impression. From the experience of friends of mine, I think, and that's why I said I wanted to ask you both, that most chambers, unless they specify on their website that they won't accept a second application, in which case take that into consideration, I think that they will probably look at your application the next year. It could be an entirely new set of people looking at your paper application, but in any event, they'll understand that the following year, if you didn't get an offer the first year, you will be coming hopefully with new experiences and, you know, different abilities, and they'll want to see those abilities. But it's not that you have one shot, that you have one, you know, one bite of the cake, or whatever whatever the idiom is. You know, there's nothing really to stop you from putting your all into something, trying as best you can, and then if you just don't quite make it that first year, trying again. No one's going to think less of you for that, I think. But that's, again,
could I give an anecdote exactly about that? I was obviously faced with that issue, having applied the first year and then, you know, having to do it again the second year. And I did apply to some sets that I'd already applied to in the first year. Most of the time it wasn't an issue, because I presumed, you know, it would be a different panel sifting the papers, or, you know, they wouldn't remember, because there are an awful lot of applicants. But there was one application I sent where they asked if you had applied for pupillage before to give your application number. And so what I wanted to do, and I was very conscious of doing in that application, was to show the progress I'd made. And so in the section, there was a box at the end, have you anything else to add? And I put down that I had done a mini pupillage at this set. I gave the feedback I'd received. I mentioned it. And I said, this is what I've done in between to implement that feedback. One thing that was mentioned was that I didn't have as, you know, as strong a grasp of the law as they might have liked, which was normal. I'd only started the GDL. I did the mini pupillage 1 month in. And so I said, they were concerned about this. So I need to show that I've made great strides in this area. So I mentioned, I took this on board. I've tried to implement it in the past year. One thing I did was I was volunteering with a group called Lawyers for Nature, and I was helping, you know, looking at planning applications with them, trying to pick out the legal challenges. And I said, this is an example of how I've tried to build up my legal knowledge. I've done more mooting, and I backed myself. So, you know, back yourself is what I would say in the next round. Don't be afraid to say, I've done this before, it didn't work. Most people do actually have a few bites at the cherry. It's very rare, you know, Stefano, fair play, because it's really, really rare to get pupillage on your first round. And the first year can be a learning experience. So don't shy away from saying what you've done. You know, you will be asked in interviews, you know, is this your second year applying, or have you applied before? What have you learned? And back yourself and say what you've done in the meantime, because you will have done a lot.
I would just add as well on what Stefano said. It's absolutely right that the way that pupillage applications are marked is, firstly, they're all anonymized. So if I was marking Stefano's application 2 years in a row, for instance, I don't see his name. I just see numbers. The other side of it as well is that they're often divided up and sifted between a pupillage committee of barristers. So it's unlikely that your application is necessarily going to be marked by the same person in the same chambers 2 years in a row. It could be, but largely, unless you've interviewed that person, you're not going to recognise the application from the previous year. I would say if you've had a previous interview at the chambers, then you are likely to be remembered. But as Claire said, it doesn't hinder you necessarily. In fact, it's quite impressive if you've got a candidate who's got through to interview a few years in a row and has applied a number of times. It tells you as a panel member that they're interested in your set, they're committed to your set. I think on balance, the potential disadvantage of putting in a slightly weaker application to a chambers that looks back on them is massively outweighed by the benefit of just putting in applications, potentially getting a pupillage, potentially getting lots of really relevant experience that helps you to get your pupillage, if not in that year, in a future year.
No, and that's certainly the feedback from, gosh, going over hundreds and hundreds of applications over the last year or so with various students. The chambers also often actively invite a further application in the following year, particularly from those candidates that make it through to, you know, second round interviews, because the bottom line is that most of the time, I'd say probably at least 50% or more of first round interviewees and probably all of your second round interviewees for most chambers are good enough. It's just who is good enough on the day and who is the best candidate on the day. And it's like any area of recruitment, actually. We don't like to say it, but it's true. It applies to every walk of life. Recruitment is arbitrary. And you may get a pupillage on, you may get a fantastic pupillage offer on one day, which you wouldn't have got the day before or the year before, because you may not have just hit that cutoff mark. So I think for all those reasons, you need to just apply, in short. And there are a couple of chambers that do specify, as Stefano noted, on their websites, but they're very clear about it. And actually what they're basically saying is, if you didn't get an interview the first time round, then you need to reevaluate your application. And have you done anything more in the interim to allow you to then progress through, not least because it's your effort and your time that's being put into these applications. But certainly a number of individuals, for example, individuals who have become reserves, have been re-invited to apply because they were good enough. It's just that there's only 2 pupillages and we don't have 3. So that type of thing. I'm just going to go through just a couple of other questions in relation to applications before returning to the questions that are being asked in the live chat. And from Claire and Stefano's perspective, what do you think made a real difference to your applications? And then I'm going to turn to Amy, if I may, and ask Amy from her perspective as a recruiter, what is it that makes applications stand out?
I can start if you want. I think in my case, it was really obvious that I wasn't a typical candidate. You know, I was in my 30s. The career I'd had before didn't really bear on, initially any relation to the career I was trying to get. But I considered that to be an advantage. I went to speak to someone at the university I was doing the GDL at, and they said, look, I think this will either get you in the room or it will mean you don't get in the room. And I think that's probably right. I think if you do have a slightly unusual path or background to show, I think you shouldn't worry that some people might say, oh, well, you're not the typical candidate that we like, therefore you're not interesting to us, because then do you really want to go there? I think more often than not, anything that you can show about yourself, your true self, that's different, that's unusual, that's unique, that can only be an advantage. And so I think what stood out for me was particular to me, but I think whatever makes you stand out is going to be your greatest strength. And I think sometimes people think it's their weakness. Oh, I want to be that candidate with a double first from X university who's done this master's in this type of law. That's great. And that could be your thing. But I would say one of the biggest takeaways for me was don't count yourself out. Let them decide. So your application, the greatest strength of your application should be what makes you different to everyone else, not you trying to be like everyone else or trying to be like what you think they want you to be. And you hear that a lot, but it's definitely true. If there's something that you think, maybe if I could be like this, I'd have a better shot. No, you're thinking in the wrong way. You should think about all the things that you're bringing into the room that is going to impress them and make them think, God, we're so lucky to have you in the room. Can we and should we give you a pupillage this year?
And turn to Claire.
Yeah, what Steph's saying really, really resonates with me. And I think this is one of the mistakes I made the first year. So I think to give a bit of my background and of where I'm coming from, because I think we all come at it from different angles. My mum worked in a factory until my second birthday, never went to university. My dad went to university in his 40s, mostly because he had 3 young kids at home and my mum, and was working in a power station as well, and got a HR qualification to continue working for the same company. So he went in his 40s, and after my dad, I'm the second person in my family to go to university, no lawyers in the family whatsoever. And I think I carried that as an anxiety, very much so, in my first year. Like, I literally just moved to London, I didn't know anybody. And I think I was afraid of really bringing across that side of myself. Probably saw it, as kind of an inferiority somehow in the first year. I really shouldn't have. And in the second year, I completely overhauled my whole approach. And I put that front and center. I said, I have my experience, that's fine. But I didn't feel like my work experience was the most important thing about me. I wasn't afraid to say that, this is the background I'm coming from. It's been hard, actually, to get on the ladder when I couldn't afford to do an unpaid internship and wanting a human rights career. If anyone else is interested in that sphere, I'm sure you'll have seen how hard it is and how scholarships helped me. And, I wasn't afraid to hide that side of myself and to put that on paper and to bring that into the room. And it made such a difference for me. I remember in one interview, one of the panelists said, was really interested to read, that, your mum and dad, they worked in factories and your dad went to university in his 40s. Oh, my parents worked in a factory as well. And that was really unusual for me at the time. coming into the bar, having that access. And so you'll be surprised. And I think it's being kind of honest about who you are as well, and not being proud of it. You know, whoever you are, wherever you're coming from, everyone will have different experiences, but ultimately that shapes you. And you'll come across as false and phony if you're trying to hide that. I think I came across a little bit maybe in my first year as, I don't think people really knew how to place me, because I was holding back a little bit. And when I didn't do that in the second year, it was really freeing for me, and I could really feel I was doing much better in my interviews and my whole approach to this crazy process.
What about you, Amy, from the other side of the table, from in the room, in fact?
I think there's a real temptation for law students and bar students to think that there's some kind of magic sparkle dust that you can just apply to your application, and it shows that you've got this amazing background and everyone will give you a pupillage. And there are certain chambers in very sort of specific commercial sets where you do need very, very strong academic qualifications. You're up against people who've all got first-class degrees from Oxford or Cambridge or strong American universities, wherever. And for those very, very niche sets, perhaps you do need a very particular set of academic qualifications or skills or whatever it would be. Apart from those sets, I would entirely agree with what Claire said, that you bring, and what Stefano said, that you bring your own experience. But to me, the only thing that you can do that applies magic sparkle dust is to ensure that your application is written really, really well. A lot of chambers, when they are marking applications, look for written advocacy. It's an opportunity for you to sell yourself, for you to persuade the person who's reading the application that you deserve an interview and that you should get a pupillage. And it's not just a form to be filled in, a tick box exercise that people kind of look at and think, oh, great, they've got this mark on that mark and they've done this mini pupillage, tick, tick, tick. They've got enough marks now, they'll get an interview. All of the pupillage application forms have questions that they ask you to answer. You obviously have to outline your academics and your experience, but questions like, why do you want to be a barrister? Why have you applied to this set? There are additional questions that chambers might put on that might be legal, they might be personal, whatever it is. And it's so, so important that you take the time to make sure your application is written really, really well, in a really focused way, that every single word that you write needs to be there, and that every single word that you write is right. And that process is horrible. It's really, really difficult and draining, and it takes ages. And we're in November at the moment. Pupillage applications open in January. If people are considering applying for pupillage this year, I would recommend starting writing your pupillage forms, certainly in December, if not now, because it takes such a long time, and you want to run it past your tutors, you want to run it past any barristers that you might know. There are people in the Inns of Court who can mentor you if you approach an inn. I'm not entirely clear if that could be done prior to the GDL, but certainly if you're on the GDL and certainly on the bar course, barristers can mentor you if you get in touch with your Inns of Court. And that's exactly the sort of thing that you want. They're exactly the sort of people you want looking over your application form, making sure it's really shiny, because it gets you a lot of marks. Written advocacy is important. It persuades the reader that actually you do have relevant experience, you do have knowledge that you're able to share. So to me, the biggest thing that makes an application stand out is it being very well written.
I couldn't agree more. It's so important because because we read so many of them that I'm afraid if you're really sloppy with your language and grammar and all the rest of it, then it's a very easy fix to then put you into the bin. It really is as simple as that, because we have far too many applications for the number of pupillages, and there are different filters that are applied, and some individuals will apply a filter that applies specifically to just grammatical errors. So just be aware of that. Most don't. But if your written advocacy is not shining through, then you're not going to get an interview, because advocacy is going to be one of the areas that every single set of chambers marks you on. And that is as much about written advocacy as it is about oral advocacy. Just picking up on what Amy was saying about time, I think Stefano and Claire, you'd probably agree that to do a good application form takes a huge amount of time. It's not a do it on the day before or the weekend before even. It's a proper process, and it's an iterative process.
Yeah, that's definitely right. And one thing I would say is the most difficult thing I found about them is that you are, as Amy was saying, you have these questions that are specific to that set of chambers in addition to your academics and those sorts of questions. And usually you have 200, 250 words. Maybe for a more elaborate question, 500 words. That's nothing. It feels like nothing. And so one thing, I mean, many of you are probably far more advanced than I was when I was thinking about pupillage applications for the first time. But some of the early tips I got were just strip it all back. No flowery language, no unnecessary adjectives, no long paragraphs, because I don't know about whether it's true, but they say, well, the one thing that's going to make someone's eyes glaze over if they see a long block of text that they're going to have to get through. So there are some really helpful, clear pointers that your tutors can help you with if you're not sure. But what takes time is not writing a long essay. It's, especially for people who are used to writing essays, perhaps, stripping everything back, so you're only putting in the bare essentials in a structure and with a style that's the most persuasive kind of written advocacy you can put on paper at that time. So that's what takes time, and it shouldn't be underestimated, I don't think.
A lot of time is just thinking about your experience as well and how you can leverage it. I spent so much time just walking, going on walks, thinking. If I was jogging, even kind of running it over in my head, what have I done and why does this show I'm going to be a good barrister? Because ultimately every question on that form, no matter what it is first of all, do you know what being a barrister is actually about? What does it entail realistically? And can you do it? Do you have what it takes to do it? And I think the first year I probably didn't leverage my experience in the way I should have. Completely echo what Amy said there about mentorship. I didn't do that in my first year. I just probably didn't know necessarily how many opportunities were out there and what was available. And in my second year applying, I had the great help of Joe with ICCA, who was there to help with looking at applications and providing shoulders to cry on and lots of advice. I also applied to the commercial bar mentorship scheme for underrepresented groups. I also got into the Inner Temple mentorship scheme. And what really, really helped me there were all the barristers who were able to look at my experience and say, for example, to give one concrete example, okay, you've worked on the abortion rights campaign in Ireland. What can you take from that to show that you're going to be a good barrister? And also, because you're working very much for one side of the issue, how are you going to be able to demonstrate? A danger for me coming from a human rights background was I seemed quite partisan sometimes in the issues I was supporting. How can you show that you'll be able to adhere to the cab rank rule and, advise and do your best for whatever client comes your way? So I really had to think hard about that, and I was conscious of that. And one thing that came to mind that I got great mileage out of this in my applications, and it really helped me, was I had actually had to represent the other side before, when I was working for the Irish government for a while, before abortion was legalised. And I had to put forward views about how we were reforming and things. So I was able to say, yes, I've worked, on this campaign for one side of the issue. I've also had to think through the other side when I worked for the Irish government. So this will help me helped show I could think through both sides of the issue as a barrister. So it was just take that experience, whatever it is. That was how I used mine to show that I could think flexibly around issues. And that will come, but it requires a great deal of thought. Something as well, one last helpful tip that maybe people aren't aware of is that the Pupillage application gateway, it does open later on, it opens in January, but you can actually already see the questions from, I think, November. So I think they might already be available. And some chambers do ask for essays. So I'd say get those out of the way early. I already kind of prepared my essays, I think, after Christmas or even a little bit in December, because you'll get tired actually through the application process. So do the essays and the kind of meatier questions or case analysis in advance, and already have a look at what the questions are and start preparing.
Yeah, totally. And also just picking up on the written applications as a question, and I'm going to move to that in a moment from the chat about written assessments. But it's probably worth pointing out that if you leave your applications to the last minute, trust me, you will not be answering those essay questions, because they take too much time and they take a lot of thought, which also means that actually you're ruling yourself out of a smaller pool of candidates because it's necessarily self-limiting. So if there is an essay question, then I suspect you'll find that there will be a smaller pool of applicants because it takes longer. So making sure that you're in the running if that's a chambers that you want to be involved in. And one of the questions on that is lots of sets of a written assessment as part of the process. What do you think is most important to show and focus on for those? I know that I've looked over lots and lots of written essays and questions as part of various individuals' pupillage processes. I think from my perspective, clear structure actually is one of the very most important things, because it really is, it goes to how you structure your answers. And as I say, it's a piece of written advocacy. And if you have the structure right, then very rarely actually will you go wrong in terms of where you're going with the content, because you will immediately work out that you're missing something. And so structure is always my starting point. But I don't know, Amy, from your perspective, I'm not sure whether your set has a written assessment process, but I suppose it's what you're looking for in any piece of written work.
Yeah, we don't have a written assessment process, but certainly what I'm well aware of is that the things that are being looked for in a written assessment, again, written advocacy, good prose, good grammar, persuasive way of writing, and obviously knowledge of the law and answering the question appropriately.
And make sure you give yourself enough time to do those written assessments, as I say. I've got a couple of other questions that deal
Can I add just one thing to that?
Of course, Stefano, please do.
One thing, I'm not sure if I've misunderstood, but there are two types, I guess, of written assessment that we could be talking about. One is when there's an assessment perhaps sent to you, usually in your second interview, I think, and we might get onto this, prior to doing the interview, where you have to do some written part. I remember doing one second round that was a whole day. But there's also, as has been alluded to or mentioned before, some sets do what they call assessed mini pupillages. So that's very much part, I think it's sometimes in lieu of a first interview or supplements the first interview. And what I would say is that on the GDL, I noticed that if you can, choose a date which is later, that's a huge benefit, because just the extra month you get, 3 weeks you get on the GDL to do some legal work, study, to look up a bit about drafting, that will really help. I remember I really didn't know what I was doing in January when I did an assessed mini. I had a great time. I really enjoyed the set, but my written work was probably not very impressive. Whereas come March, even when I had the time to try and practice or teach myself the very basics, as you were saying, of structure, things you do get taught on the bar course, that stands you in really good stead. So I think perhaps if you are going to be applying during your GDL year for sets which need assessed minis, don't rush to do them earlier than you need to, and certainly go above and beyond to go and teach yourself some of the basics that you won't be taught until the bar course. So even if you can find, I think there was, in our library, there was the Oxford, the OUP drafting manual, or the opinion manual, just to see what an introduction looks like, how you might organize your headings. Even that can just, give you that extra boost, so you don't feel like you're completely making it up and no one's told you the very basics.
And Stefano's right. Every chambers also has a different assessment and recruitment process. Some have written assessments in the application form. Some have assessed mini pupillages, where written work is part and parcel, actually, of that assessment process. Others have assessment days, selection days, where you may well be asked to do a written piece of advocacy or an oral piece of advocacy or a presentation. All of those different aspects are testing ultimately those skills of written and oral advocacy across the board, including your presentation skills. So what I will say is that each of chambers is actually very transparent now as to their processes. If you go to a chamber's website, it typically will set out exactly what their pupillage application process is. So just be aware of it, because then you'll know what they're looking for. They also, generally speaking, set out their marking scheme so that you know what areas you have to be hitting. I'm just aware that we've only got 7 or so minutes left. It's going very quickly through this session. So if I can just move very quickly, if I may, to asking just both Claire and Stefano, if you have one piece of advice as to how to approach the application process, what would it be? I think, Claire, you probably touched upon it from your perspective in terms of reframing aspects before. So, but is there anything else that you would say, Claire, on that?
Just to echo the point about structure being very important. So just in the written application phase, something that I adopted, and I think this is quite foolproof, really, as it worked for me anyway, and I think it's a good way of approaching it, is if you have an essay, try to kind of package things into 3 points that you have for the argument or against the proposition, depending on the side you're asked to take. But then always leave some space to say the strongest counter argument against what I've said is X, and then say why you're still right. And I think that really works well, because it shows you're able to think around an issue, and that you have a broad mind, that you're able to basically not be weak as a barrister without being able to see the opposing side's arguments. That's something I think that they want to see very much in written applications and in interviews, that you won't be hit by the train of the opposing side and not know. And this applies equally in interviews. So one tip was really just think around issues. Read the news, ask yourself, what do you think about this? So, mandatory lockdowns for the unvaccinated, that's something that's coming up now. Think about, what do you think of that? What are your 3 points for or against it? What's the strongest point against you? And keep a list of questions. I started doing a list of questions, I think almost after I didn't get pupillage in my first year, of news items that were coming up, really topical, current affairs, legal issues, putting down my 3 points for and against. And that helped me immensely. Pupillage interviews get a little bit samey after a while. There's only so many topical legal issues that barristers can think of. And there were times I was able to trot out the same thing again and again towards the end and have my 3 points for and against. So approach it in that structured way, be organised, and try and package. I know it's a bit cliched, but just try to help yourself with your structure. Just package things in 3 arguments, 3 points for or against. It's a little bit boring, but really this is all about strategy, really, and just do what you need to do to get yourself over the line. And I think that is a help.
Yeah, really briefly, I would say in terms of written applications, this sounds so stupid. And when people told me, I thought, well, what do you mean? Go back and make sure you've actually answered the question that's being asked. They are all often seemingly very similar, but there'll be something slightly different. And I mean, one thing that the people reading these applications will be good at is picking you out for anything that you've not been focused enough on. So really go back and make sure, what is the question actually asking me? Am I answering exactly what's being asked? And also think, who's reading this? It was mentioned earlier that the one question you have to prepare for as early as possible and keep going back to it and refining it is, why do you want to be a barrister? But if that's the question asked, also think to yourself, why do I want to be a family barrister? Or why do I want to be a commercial barrister or construction barrister, whatever it is? Because that should be part of your answer too, even if you're not being asked, because that's what you're saying you want to be. And you have to show that you understand what that means. And you have to have a clear reason for answering, this is why.
Thanks, Steph. And Amy, perhaps if I can jump to the interviews themselves, not just the applications, but the interviews themselves. What advice would you have for future barrister hopefuls, pupillage applicants, in terms of the interviews and preparing for those interviews and how to approach that process?
So preparation is really key. You'll have written your application forms typically in January, February, and you'll have been working on them hopefully since before then. Your interview probably won't be till March or April. So there's a lot of time for you to forget what you've written. Make sure you go back over your application form. If you've been asked a specific question, for instance, what do you think is the most interesting case in the last 12 months? And you've written about a case, make sure you've read the case again. Make sure you've read your answer again. Make sure you're properly prepared, because you can be asked anything on your forms. And I've certainly had interviews where I've asked people questions on their forms and they've clearly not looked back over it fully. Perhaps there's a question we've asked that they haven't answered many times. There's no excuse for that, really. You've got 20 minutes in an interview to impress. You've got loads of time before then to prep. So do your prep, do your research. The other thing I would say is that make sure you also really, really thoroughly research Chambers. Chambers put a huge amount of information on their websites now, not just about the pupillage process and the applications process, but also about what that Chambers is up to, cases that people have recently been involved in, what events have been on. Chambers have Twitter accounts, some have Instagram accounts. Read them. I'm always surprised by the number of applicants who don't. And we often ask our candidates what they know about Chambers, and they often don't have particularly good answers, even though even an hour's research could have given them a really, really impressive answer. So for me, interviewing, in terms of preparation, make sure you do it. In terms of being in the interview itself, going back to what Claire said, it's really important to be yourself. Barristers, some people have it in their head that barristers are these shiny other people and that they need to behave like a barrister somehow, and they put on some kind of persona of what they think a barrister is. Maybe it's someone who's really argumentative, maybe it's someone who's really posh. Whatever it is, we don't want to see that. What we want to see is who you are, obviously in a professional setting, in a professional context, where you're using professional language and behaving professionally. But there's no barrister who's one type, and that's what we want to see. It's really important that you are yourself and that you're therefore quite honest about yourself. So those are my top key interview takeaways.
Amy, thank you. I guess the point there is be yourself and make sure that your application shows you and that you shine through your application, because the one thing that we are trained to do as barristers is sniff out anything that's not authentic effectively. That's part of our job at the end of the day. And what we want to see is the authentic you. And also that will give you your very best hope of shining through, actually, because if you're trying to be somebody you're not, you're going to fall down at some point. And it won't be very attractive or pleasant when you do. So thank you very much to everybody. If I can just round off now, perhaps on a very positive note, and it's simply this: how did it feel when you found out that you had pupillage? To both of you, and obviously, Steph, you're now undertaking your pupillage, and is it everything you thought it would be, or is it just a very big uphill, steep learning curve?
I think both of those things. It was great because you realize your hard work has paid off, and you have this challenge that's guaranteed, hopefully, and it spurs you on. So it's really a great relief if and when it ever comes. But also, I would say, because one of the questions I was thinking of is, how do you deal with rejection? As someone who'd done 10 years of auditions, I thought, quite well. But I think, the people who get, if they do 6, 7 offers, that they haven't applied to 6 or 7 places, which means that they've got rejections too. So, the offer that if you get an offer and you can accept it, you feel wonderful, but that doesn't mean that the people who are successful or who are going to become barristers are spending their entire time through the pupillage application process feeling wonderful. It's going to be a long slog. It's going to be difficult, but that's the resilience and that's the tenacity that you need, I think, to not just go through pupillage, but also to practice as a barrister. So it's a long up and down journey. And yes, getting pupillage offer is brilliant, but also just having done a few weeks now, pupillage itself is quite difficult as well. So it's not the end of the road by any means.
Thanks, Steph. And Claire, how do you feel?
Oh, it felt wonderful and such a relief as well, because I think it is a really hard process. There's no way of sugarcoating that. I remember at one point in April just being so tired. I remember I just started to cry one Sunday morning. I ever said to my partner, I don't feel like a human. I feel like a candidate. And he said, no, you are a human. And I think that can sometimes happen. When you're so invested in this process, it can take over. So I'd say try and keep a sense of perspective as much. Look after yourselves. Sometimes we can try to over prepare. I know I did, because I'm this kind of person that likes to feel like I have all my ducks in a row and everything is ready. It's not that kind of process. So somehow even just give yourself time to take a step back. Instead of, I think it was late in the process, I changed things. I started going for a run before my interviews. I felt so much better. I performed so much better. And there were car crashes along the way. My God, I can think of so many, where the interview, afterwards, you're sort of shell shocked. You're wondering what just happened there. and then, the next day or an hour or two later, sometimes you might have interviews on the same day. 2 hours later, you might have an interview that goes great. So I think just try and look after yourselves. Remember, there will be massive highs and lows, as Steph said. And then, if the moment comes, hopefully, as I'm sure it will for many, that you do get that offer, enjoy it, and then just do take a moment to think back on it and to give yourself a pat on the back, because it's not easy, and do enjoy it, because it takes a long time to get there, and yeah, savor the moment. I suppose that's what I tried to do anyway.
Well, thank you to each of you for appearing on the panel today, and thank you to all of you for attending the open day. Hopefully that's helped a little bit. I'll stay behind and try and answer some of the questions that weren't able to be answered within the session in the chat. But for now, good luck and thank you all very much. Take care.
Thanks.
Good luck.
Good luck, everyone.